Good morning and welcome to this very special edition of OFC Bite Size in partnership with DEFRA. I am Sally Williams, a dairy farmer and the chairman of the Oxford Farming Conference. For those of you who are new to the OFC today, we are a charity run by a council of volunteer directors. This year, the conference reaches a significant milestone. January will see the 75th conference held, usually in the examination schools of Oxford, but in light of the current pandemic, it will unsurprisingly be online this year. In recognition of this incredible achievement, thanks to the hard work of the volunteer directors who have preceded myself and the current council of volunteers, we have been reflecting on the history and heritage of the conference by re-examining a theme from each of the conference's 7 decades, giving you a bite-sized experience of the conference. Today, though, we are looking to the future, as we do every January when the Oxford Farming Conference is held. That future is heavily influenced by policymakers and focuses our attentions on what direction is best for each of our own businesses. We are delighted to be welcoming George Eustice, Environment Secretary, to today's Bite Size. As someone with a deep mistrust of SatNav, I'm looking forward to hearing George lay out the roadmap of the future of agriculture and the environment for England. I'm sure you will have plenty of questions for the Secretary of State, so please enter them in the Q&A box and we will endeavour to ask as many as we can following the independent panel. Some questions have been pre-submitted by email. Thank you, but I'm afraid I won't be asking these as it's only fair that those who have joined us today get the chance to have their question heard given the short time we will have available. Today will be chaired by my fellow volunteer director, the fabulous Sarah Mukherjee, who will introduce the Minister and the independent panel following this short video.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you very much, Secretary of State, and a very warm welcome from me to this, as you said, Sally, very special Oxford Farming Conference bite-sized webinar. My name's Sarah Mukherjee, and I'm a director of the OFC, as Sally said, and I'll also be your facilitator this morning. As well as the Secretary of State, we're joined by a panel of thought leaders and practitioners who will be commenting on, and I suspect challenging, the Minister's vision this morning. We'll hear from them after the Minister's speech, but first it's time to hear from the DEFRA Secretary of State, George Eustice. Minister, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and it's a real privilege to be here this morning to launch our agricultural transition plan. I'd like to begin by thanking the Oxford Farming Conference for hosting this event. Of course, we all look forward to the time when we will have turned the corner of this pandemic and can return to meeting again properly. But for now, let me start by taking this opportunity to thank all those working in our food supply chain to keep the nation fed. The response of the sector has been phenomenal and has been a timely reminder of the critical importance of domestic food production to our food security as a nation. Now, my family have farmed in West Cornwall for 6 generations. The names of fields were passed from one generation to the next. Like all farmers, we knew our land, and so I understand the responsibility that farmers feel to the hard work of previous generations and also their commitment to the future. So as we contemplate the biggest change in agricultural policy in half a century, we need to design a policy that is not only right for those who are the custodians of our countryside today, but which is also right for those who follow in their footsteps tomorrow, those who we've yet to meet, those perhaps who yearn to get into farming but cannot currently get access to land, the the farm managers who want to set out on their own, maybe those who left the family farm 20 years ago but wish they could find a way to return. So today we are publishing further details of our approach to changing the way we reward and incentivize farmers. We will remove the arbitrary area-based subsidies on land ownership or tenure and replace them with new payments and new incentives to reward farmers for farming more sustainably, creating space for nature on their land, enhancing animal welfare, and delivering, of course, the other objectives set out in the Agriculture Act 2020. We will remove the old-style top-down rules and draconian penalties of the EU era, starting with important changes next year that will substantially reduce the guidance that farmers need to follow. This, of course, is a moment of great change. For the first time in 50 years, we have a chance to do things differently. So we should not waste that opportunity. We should think through from first principles what a coherent policy actually looks like, and then chart an orderly course towards it. And there is no doubt that the intensification of agriculture since the 1960s has taken its toll on wildlife and on nature. So to address this, we need to rediscover some of the agronomic techniques that perhaps my great-grandfather might have deployed, but then fuse these with the best precision technology and the best plant science available to us today. The centerpiece of our future policy will be made up of three component parts. Firstly, the sustainable farming incentive will pay farmers who are in receipt of BPS for actions that they take to manage their land in an environmentally sustainable way. Secondly, the local nature recovery will pay for actions that support local nature recovery and deliver local environmental priorities. This scheme will also encourage collaboration, helping farmers work together to improve their local environment. Finally, landscape recovery will support the delivery of landscape and ecosystem recovery level improvements through long-term land use change products. They will help us to meet our targets to plant 30,000 hectares of woodland per year by 2025, to create and restore some of our peatlands, and protect 30% of land by 2030 to reach net zero by 2050. We know that this marks a significant change, and I'm also very conscious of the fact that for many farm enterprises, they are dependent on the area subsidy payments to generate a profit, and that without it, some might judge that they would not be profitable. So that is why we've created a 7-year transition period. We want this to be an evolution, not an overnight revolution. That means making year-on-year progressive reductions to the legacy direct payment scheme, but simultaneously making year-on-year increases to the money available to support the replacement schemes. Between 2021 and 2024, we will help farmers prepare to take part in environmental land management. This will include expanding the countryside stewardship scheme and opening a new sustainable farming incentive, which will be open to every farmer from 2022 onwards. And we will also continue to develop pilots for environmental land management. We will also increase the amount of funding available for environmental and animal welfare improvements in each year of the early transition, using funding released from direct payments as we move towards the rollout of the three components under environmental land management, which will then take effect in full from 2024. We recognize that there is a problem with poor profitability in agriculture, but the premise behind our new policy is to tackle the causes of that poor profitability rather than masking it with a subsidy payment. So our new financial incentives for sustainable farming and nature recovery will be set at a rate to incentivize widespread participation and will give consideration to natural capital principles so that in some areas we will go beyond the income foregone methodology of the past. To support farmers in reducing their costs and improving their profitability, there will be new grants to invest in new equipment to reduce costs. There will be exit schemes to help those who want to retire or leave the industry to do so with dignity. And there will be grants to create new opportunities and support for new entrants coming into the industry. We will also provide grants for farmer-led research and development and for the use of innovative new techniques led by farmers and growers. I'd like to say a little bit more about what the early part of the transition is going to look like. So next year, we will begin to reduce direct payments, improve how existing schemes and regulations operate, and offer grants to help farmers invest in environmental and productivity improvements. Reductions in direct payments will begin at 5% for most farmers. Enforcement will be more proportionate, with written communications rather than financial penalties, and the approach taken to inspections will be overhauled. We will continue our program of tests and trials and start a new national pilot for environmental land management. And our future agriculture policy will also be designed with farmers for farmers, so that it works in fields and on farms, not just on paper. I know we haven't always got it right in the past. I know that administrative processes have caused problems. And I want farmers to trust our reforms, and we want to work with you all to get this right. In 2022 and 2023, we intend to reduce spending on direct payments further by around 15% in each of those years. And we will start to roll out some of the core elements of environmental land management. The Sustainable Farming Incentive will support approaches to farm husbandry that help the environment, and it might include promoting integrated pest management, actions to improve soil health, or catchment-sensitive farming. We will make more funding available within the Legacy Countryside Stewardship Scheme. We will offer a slurry investment scheme to help reduce pollution, take us close to net zero, and help us leave the environment in a better state than we found it. There will be standalone projects to support tree planting, peatland restoration, and nature recovery. And we will be launching a new industry-led R&D scheme to invest in innovation and to benefit farmers. We will also, as I said, offer an exit support scheme to help farmers who want to retire to do so with dignity and to help new entrants into the industry. And we will be consulting further on these scheme designs in the new year. And we will begin rolling out the full 3 components of our environmental land management in late 2024. By the end of 2024, legacy basic payment schemes probably will have been reduced by about 50%. We then intend to de-link direct payments, and the bureaucracy of cross-compliance regime would be a thing of the past. By 2027, we want to see a reformed agriculture sector. We want farmers to manage their whole business in a way that delivers profitable food production and the recovery of nature, combining the best of modern technology with the rediscovery of the traditional art of good farm husbandry. And we want farmers to be able to access public money to help them tackle climate change and support the environment and animal welfare on the land they manage, and to help their businesses become more productive and sustainable. We want to support confidence in UK food internationally, prevent environmental harm, and protect biosecurity and animal welfare. In conclusion, rather than the prescriptive, top-down rules of the EU era, we want to support the choices that farmers and landowners take on their holdings, and we will work with them to refine and develop the schemes we bring forward. If we all work together to get this right, then I believe a decade from now, the rest of the world will be coming here to see how it's done. Thank you.
Secretary of State, many thanks indeed. And whilst our virtual audience digests that, let me introduce you to our panel. Caroline Eyre is a Chartered Forester and the England National Manager for the Confederation of Forest Industries, or CONFOR. She leads for CONFOR on the co-design of the Environmental Land Management Scheme. Sarah Bell is a beef, sheep and arable farmer in Rutland, where she works with her parents and husband on her family farm. She's also a consultant specialising in sustainable supply chains, and sits on the NFU Combinable Crops Board. Jake Fines is a General Manager of Conservation for the Hokum Estate and Director of the Hokum National Nature Reserve. He sits on the NFU's Environmental Forum and on RSPB England Committee. And Nick Renison farms with her husband Paul in Cumbria, a 350-acre upland farm, which can, she says, gets battered by the formidable Helm wind. She finds the sweet spot now as a mixture of livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs and poultry farming with a growing interest in regenerative agriculture. That's your panel, and I shall now ask them to give them their first thoughts and some challenges to the Secretary of State. Caroline, if you'd like to start.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. Yes, can the Minister assure us that throughout the forward delivery of this plan, there will be a level playing field for the forestry and timber industry, with inclusive language and visibility within DEFRA and its communications, promoting sustainable food farming, or maybe forestry, honouring past generations of foresters and supporting future generations of foresters to contribute to an environmental land management model with resilient businesses and a resilient landscape? I have further questions, but maybe that one first.
Thanks very much. Secretary of State, is it okay if we ask our panellists to give their thoughts, and we'll take those questions all together before we go to the general public and the audience? Thank you. Sarah, you're up next.
Thank you. As a regenerative farmer, I welcome the approach, and warm words as ever, but precious little for me to make decisions in terms of planning the future of my business on. I think we've maybe just had an announcement of a succession of announcements, which I look forward to with interest. What assessment has DEFRA made of the financial impact on farm businesses of the reduction to BPS, especially with regard to tenant farmers, livestock farmers, and those whose businesses may not be able to access capital to co-invest through the productivity schemes? I'm particularly concerned that it would appear that the average farm is deemed to be around 300 acres, and many people farming on that sort of scale have the assets tied up in their business and their own ingenuity, but not a lot of spare to be investing in much more. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Jake, next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Secretary of State. I welcome the announcement in creating a farm support system that recognises the importance of the natural world and the role of farmers and land managers, being part of the solution in the recovery of nature within our protected landscapes and beyond. I'm also pleased to see that the government has taken note of the Dame Glenys Stacey report and is following the recommendations of the Glover Review, also recognising the importance of advice through this period of transition and beyond. The Secretary of State will have heard numerous times that this paper fails to give any significant detail required for farm businesses to make changes, whether looking for solutions to meet net zero, be sustainable in the production of food, but also those farmers wishing to embrace the proposed changes. All of this requires planning. I urge the Secretary of State to give greater detail to allow farm business to invest in this. I'm intrigued to understand how decoupling will work for the benefit of new entrants. The paper suggests that initially businesses that claim direct support will be able to access the scheme. This is suggesting that the money that the government has committed to in this agricultural sector could also be accessed to others in the future. Is this the case?
Thanks, Jake. And Nick, finally, thank you.
As an upland farmer, I completely agree. The future is a more nature-friendly, regenerative farming model. Our countryside needs to be a vibrant place. Bees buzzing, pigs rooting, dairy cows at pasture, beef and cattle in rotation, all producing environmental benefits. The worry I have, and that many others have, is that all this is happening in the countryside, and then in the forefront there is supermarket delivery vans delivering food from not so climate friendly countries. We need a thriving local food economy, food that's highly nutritious and affordable. This has huge benefits, knock-on benefits to the local economy, tourism, local health, well-being. I want Cumbrian farmers to feed Cumbrians. So I'm asking for your commitment and support to shorten supply chains, more local abattoirs, more local butchers, farmer cooperatives, market gardening at field scale, even in Cumbria. This all is possible, Mr. Eustice, and it needs to happen quite quickly.
Great, thank you very much, panel. Well, quite a lot to chew over there, Secretary of State. I wonder if perhaps we could start with this question about a series of announcements, because it's, I think there's no disagreement across the panel that more regenerative methods are a good thing, but they want to see the devil that's maybe in the detail.
Well, look, this document runs to some 60 pages, and the first 25 or so pages describe the journey over the next 4 years in particular, year by year, chronologically, what farmers can expect. And then in the annexes, there are actually quite a lot of detailed schemes that are described. Now, those schemes aren't open yet, but they will be open, obviously, for 2022 when we roll out the sustainable farming incentives. So for now, I think farmers can see the emerging government policy here that enables them to inform their business decisions. They can see, for instance, that if they felt now would be a good time to consider to retire, and that will be the case for some farmers, well, then there's a scheme there to help them do that. If they decided that they wanted to get into countryside stewardship in a bigger way, they can do that from 2022. We're going to be expanding the budget to enable that to take place. They will be able to see that as they lose their basic payment scheme payments in 22 and 23, they will universally have the option to go into a sustainable farming incentive scheme. And we've described what that might be. It might be an integrated pest management scheme. It might be a scheme around soil health. And we've got some examples of good schemes that are already out there on a voluntary basis. We have, for instance, the LEAF scheme, which is predominantly for growers. And that is that's a holistic whole farm approach to managing your farm in a particular sustainable way. We've got catchment sensitive farming schemes that farmers sign up to. So we've got some examples of these kind of holistic whole farm schemes out there now. What's different is that they'll be rewarding farmers for that in future.
Thank you. The point that Nick and Jake both made about this perhaps slightly unlevel playing field, we've heard that a lot from farmers in the past, that it's great to have a regenerative model, high standards, high welfare. But if that means that British farmers are losing out to competition from abroad, which is not being farmed to the same standards, then that doesn't really help UK farming overall.
Well, that's why one of the central concepts behind this bill is that we will be rewarding and supporting farmers for going above and beyond the regulatory baseline on issues such as animal welfare. And it means, and this is the first time any country has done this at scale, rather than constantly ratcheting up regulation and meaning that you're putting your producers at a disadvantage to others around the world, we're going to do two things. First of all, when it comes to that regulatory baseline, we're going to factor that into our trade negotiations. And we've been explicit that we will use tariff policy to prevent our producers being undermined by lower regulatory standards. Secondly, we will also be paying farmers to go above and beyond that regulatory baseline.
And the question of local food economies as well. I mean, as Nick and again Jake both pointed out, that is something that could be very central to making sure that UK farming is properly sustainable. But there's not a lot at the moment that supports that outside the quite niche farmers markets and farm shops at the moment.
Well, I think actually we've been seeing a growing trend even among the multiple retailers, the big supermarkets, to wanting to source more of their farm produce from British farmers. They make a big deal about this. If you go to a supermarket, it's pictures of British farmers that are up there on the display boards. They're keen to make that part of their brand almost universally. It's also the case that they're sometimes now going for smaller producers in local stores so that they can get that local supply chain as well. But look, ultimately, a lot of this is for the market. Government can do so much. We will be there to support farms who want to diversify and pursue a different model. There will be grants available to enable them to do that. But there's also a role for the market here. And we've seen I think, quite a transformation in the last 15 to 20 years, with the public showing much more interest in food provenance, big growth in the farm shop sector, which has been very successful in the last decade in particular. And I think that may well continue.
But to get those
attention, attention. This is an all-staff announcement.
Apologies,
In
we have.
remembrance of those who lost.
If you can concentrate on two things at the same time, Minister, which I know might be a bit difficult with that blaring in your ear, but it's still quite niche though, isn't it? I appreciate that supermarkets are making more of an effort, but to get that proper upscaling to make sure that properly sustainable regenerative British farming has a future, there needs to be more. I mean, will you be doing more to encourage supermarkets, or maybe even more than encourage supermarkets to support UK farming?
Sarah, I wonder if you could repeat that. I'm afraid we had a rather irritating tannoy announcement, and to spare the audience on this webinar from it, I put myself on mute, but I couldn't hear a word you said because I was being shouted at over the tannoy system.
I quite understand, one of the joys of a virtual webinar. That supermarkets have been, I mean, we take your point that there has been an uptick, but really there needs to be much more of a step change if we are going to support UK regenerative farming. Maybe supermarkets need to be more than just encouraged to support UK farming if we're to make sure that UK agriculture is sustainable for the medium and long term.
Well, look, I think you have to disaggregate where the role for government is and where the role for industry is and where the role for retailers is. I actually think in the UK we've created something really quite special, which is a highly sophisticated food market where there's a high degree of consumer engagement, a lot of consumer interest in food provenance. That's come about for a range of reasons. Some of it is government being willing to offer grants to support farmers to develop some of these more local supply chains. Some of it is through a robust regulatory system that gives people faith and trust in our standards. Some of it is through farmers and businesses themselves building a market, building a brand. And some of it is due to retailers having the foresight to see the direction of travel in consumer opinion. So there's a role for government here. Our new policy will support farmers for public goods, and if they go above the regulatory baseline on something like animal welfare, they will can expect to benefit from that financially from the government, but they will also, of course, be winning a premium in the market.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. We'll be coming to our panel members a little bit later for their thoughts and reactions on those comments. But Sally, I believe you've got some questions from our audience.
The first question is from John File. Is it responsible to incentivise marginal sustainable farmland being forested or put to environment schemes only to transfer our food supply to more fragile foreign soils with cheaper production costs?
Well, obviously that wouldn't be the right way to go. But I think when I think about what the future shape of agriculture might look like, I think it is possible to see that you could have sustainable intensification on some of your more productive soils. That is adopting agronomic techniques that are better for soil health, better for water quality, better for reduced pesticide use, and have far lower environmental impacts. But by using the best agri-tech technology available to us today, doing that in a way that doesn't compromise yields. And that does enable you to start to support a more extensive farming system in some landscapes. And it does enable you to potentially release the land to do some of that woodland creation and tree planting, which is going to be important if we're to hit our carbon targets. We've got an objective of planting 30,000 hectares of trees by 2025. We do need to release some land to do that. Different landowners in different landscapes will take different choices. And so for some, they will pursue that sustainable intensification route. For others, they may choose to farm in a slightly more extensive way, reducing their input costs and benefiting from some of the grants the government makes available to support nature's recovery. And then finally, some may go for a more fundamental land use change on small parts of their land. And if you get the balance of all of those things right, and indeed also develop concepts like vertical farming or a new generation of glasshouse production, I think you can actually see a way through this where you actually still have food production in this country, increase that food production, but also do it sustainably and also be able to release land for that woodland creation that's so important.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks, Sally, and thanks, Secretary of State. Any other questions at the moment, Sally? I'm sure you've got, how many bucket loads of questions, shall we say, do you have? And would you like to take the first few hundred?
It's safe to say I am madly scrolling up and down. Thank you to everyone who is submitting questions. And you will see yourselves in the Q&A box that a significant number of them have common themes. So apology if it's not your question asked, but across the panel asking questions and also the questions we do select, I'm confident we will cover most of the sentiment. We have Alan Buckwell asking, is the government committed to follow the recommendations of the forthcoming National Food Strategy? With Theresa Wickham then following up with, so how do you see the new farming strategy delivering an affordable, sustainable food plan for all?
Well, look, this is an independent review being run by Henry Dimbleby, so it's separate from government. It's been deliberately set up in that way. I think in the interim report, there were some, really interesting ideas there that are very much, in line with government thinking, particularly on our approach to trade agreements and the importance of recognizing standards in that. Also in terms of encouraging a healthier diet in the population and in many other areas too. So I think there were some very interesting proposals that have come forward from that food review, but it is independent, and the government will obviously look at the final report expected in the spring or summer before deciding what our response to that is. And we've set out today in this agricultural transition plan our direction of travel on agriculture policy.
Many thanks, Secretary of State. I should declare an interest as I sit on the advisory panel for the National Food Strategy, so I'm very glad to hear that. Maybe just quickly go back to our panel for a thought and sense check. Caroline, you've heard mentioned in passing there, mention of forestry. Are you satisfied that this is heading in the direction that you'd like to see it?
Sort of. There's still no assurance that forestry will have an equal footing. I mean, there's a question there about offsetting food supply. We import 80%, net import 8% of what we use in this country for timber. Our timber demand is set to treble by 2050 worldwide. So it's right that we continue to offset our own sustainable timber production to other countries that don't have those sustainability standards. We need to really consider how we reach compromises on how we use our land, and I don't have that assurance yet, no.
Sarah, I wonder if I could come to you next. The point that you made about regenerative agriculture and this tension with that and affordable food. I mean, we mustn't forget there are millions of people in the country, especially at the moment, who are struggling to put food on the table. How do you think that this framework set out by the Secretary of State might help us get a little further down that path in meeting those challenges?
I'm not sure, Sarah, to be honest. It was clear from the lack of an answer about impact assessment of this change of policy that the government currently doesn't have an answer on this. Therefore, I'd absolutely urge them to undertake an impact assessment which looks at both the impact of policy on farm and the impact of policy in the food supply chain, right down to people's tables. Because as one of the most developed economies in the world, I am fundamentally uncomfortable with children going to school with empty stomachs. So it's absolutely vital the government supports this change of funding model with enabling policy across government, from school meals to public procurement to planning policy, to allow a food chain that is functioning and functioning well, where the real cost of food is covered, but also poverty is addressed in our society, quite frankly.
Jake, you have been a great proponent of environmental farming that can also be productive and profitable. Do you think that what you've heard so far gives you hope that that will be very much the case in the next 5 to 10 years?
It gives me hope, but it also makes me nervous. There's very little detail there's very little detail at all. Actually, it's quite a broad brush approach to a 7-year transition. It fails to recognise those that are already delivering and are going above and beyond. I don't see any language in that those that have made significant changes in improving their farms and already having sustainable food production going on through regenerative agriculture. There's some amazing examples throughout the country of this. I'm also not to have any conflict with Caroline. I have a concern with this obsession with planting trees. and the right tree in the right location and the right species. And we have numerous causes for concern with some of the diseases we're seeing within our forestry. But also, if we look at when there was a forestry initiative decades ago, and we saw vast parts of Suffolk and Norfolk forested, if we make big changes now, we could have detrimental impacts to some very fragile habitats in due course. And I just need to make sure that the Secretary of State is aware of something that is implemented now will have long-term effects both on our environments but also our businesses.
I will allow Caroline Rice to reply a little later on, but I just want to move to Nick before we go back to the Secretary of State, and then some more questions from Sally. So Nick, you are walking the talk at the moment, up there with the wind blowing very hard in your face. How do you feel from what you've heard so far? Do you feel that there's confidence for the future of your farm?
Well, George, I'm a bit disappointed, really. Local abattoirs are key. Local food is key. We need to have a vibrant, outside the box thinking community. And I think you just mainly want food to go through supermarkets and travel a long way to do that. And if we want to attract young people to continue the agricultural industry, I think you need to have a look again and be a bit more open-minded.
Secretary of State, well, as the young people would say, I think the response is a bit meh, really. Anything you can do to support some of those concerns?
Well, let me come back on this. To be fair, I wasn't given a chance to come back on Caroline or Sarah's initial question because we moved to questions from the audience. But let me just address those. Well, Caroline's point about forestry, absolutely. Commercial forestry is going to play a big part of our tree planting targets. We will never get to that kind of area of woodland creation unless a significant chunk of it is commercial forestry. So it's a big part of our plan. Jake makes a very important point, which is in the early 1970s when there was a lot of encouragement to plant forestry. A lot of it was planted in the wrong place. A lot of it dried out some of our peatlands and has therefore paradoxically being counterproductive from a carbon point of view. So you've got to plant the right trees in the right places. It's also the case that some of the species that lend themselves well to commercial forestry have fewer benefits by way of biodiversity. So we've got to get that balance right between the broadleaf deciduous woodland that we'll want to be planting in some areas where biodiversity will be a key part of the objective, but also some of that commercial forestry, which will be critical to get to the numbers and to help us get towards net zero. And on Sarah's point about the impacts, I think it's very hard to, and this is the point I'd make, very hard to look at this in static isolation. We can do this, and we have indeed done it, to say, let's look at the average profitability of different sectors. Let's see what their average BPS payment, do they lose money, yes or no? If you do that, the answer is yes, a significant number, well over half, would in theory be losing money were it not for the BPS payment. And there are, particular pressures on some livestock sectors, notably beef and sheep. But equally, you have to ask the question, who gets the subsidy payment? We know that farmers are the recipients of the subsidy, but are they the only beneficiary or even the main beneficiary? And I think the truth is that if you inject sort of irrational subsidy into land ownership, which is what's happened over the last 20 years, all sorts of things come out in the wash. It inflates land prices, it causes people to cling on to land when they might otherwise have retired and blocks the path of new entrants. It can inflate input costs. All sorts of things come out in the wash. It also means that farmers are more likely to end up being price takers because a purchaser in the supply chain will say, well, he's still making a profit because he's got his BPS payment. Therefore, I can get away with paying him a bit less. Once you start to unravel the distortions of a sort of irrational subsidy being injected into the system, a lot of other things start to come into balance. So we may see an adjustment in land rents, which will reduce the cost for the tenanted sector. We may see, in conjunction with some of the other measures we've outlined in the agriculture bill, improved fairness and transparency in the supply chain so that farmers get a fairer price for the food that they produce. Now, that is the way we should be tackling poor profitability, not putting the sticking plaster of a subsidy payment over the top of it.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Sally, a few more questions from the audience, please.
So most of our audience are asking for a lot more specifics. So can Secretary of State give a more specific timeline in terms of when the detail is going to be announced? The devil is always in the detail. When can people expect this? But also then a specific question from Andrew Meredith is, has DEFRA modelled how many farmers are likely to take a lump sum exit payment? And can you tell us what the tax implications of these payments will be? And the flip side, we have a lot of new entrants and young farmers who are asking, as a successor, will they be considered a new entrant and therefore eligible for the support to allow the older generation to retire whilst leaving them a viable business?
Many thanks, Sally.
Yes, so we're working at the moment on the concept of the exit payment. Broadly speaking, we'd envisage there being a qualifying period, so it wouldn't be right to have somebody who just joined the industry next year taking a lump sum to leave. So there'll be a qualifying period from a point in history, and we're working on what that should be. And we'll be consulting on that in the new year. We will then pay a multiple of the annual basic payment scheme. We are looking at this issue of tax because we recognize that that's a factor that will, particularly in partnerships, would affect the take up of such a proposal. So we're looking closely at that. And broadly speaking, the condition of the scheme would be that the farmer forfeits their so-called entitlements to the old legacy scheme and either rents or sells their land. And I would envisage that people would want to rent their land out in many cases, creating an opportunity for a new entrant, and that new entrant could then receive the support on offer to set up a new enterprise on that holding.
Just before I ask Sally for another question, I wonder if I could ask a supplementary that's related to this, and that's diversity in the farming sector. As we know, farming is one of the least diverse. It's difficult if you're not from a traditional background to get into farming. Will there be measures in the package you've just mentioned to help support that increase in diversity? Because of course, diversity of people means diversity of thought, which means a better, resilient and more sustainable farming sector.
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, I'm somebody who comes from a family that's farmed for 6 generations, so I'm not a good example, if you like, of somebody who comes in with change and different thinking. But I have always recognised that new people coming in, perhaps having had experience in a different industry, can bring a great perspective to the industry. And some of the most successful farming entrepreneurs we have are often those who maybe learned a slightly different skill set in a slightly different sector and then chose to enter farming a little bit later in life, perhaps in their 40s, wanting a change in direction, a change in lifestyle, but they bring back to the farm something new, something different, something fresh that can actually really show progress. So yes, absolutely. We want the future farming policy to create space for those new people. It might be people who have a yearning to go farming, but haven't previously been able to get access to land. It might indeed be people who grew up on a farm and chose to go away to the bright lights in the city and pursue a different career, but now would like to return to the farm and are looking for a way back onto the farm. The most important thing we can do to create opportunities for those new entrants is to support other farmers to retire with dignity, to make way so that there can be new holdings coming onto the market, new opportunities for a new generation.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Before I go to Sally, I think Jake has a question on this topic.
Secretary of State, I believe the Treasury might have a view on this, because if you're going to let a farmer retire in dignity, and you give him with a lump sum based on his BPS entitlement, surely the new entrant then claims some sort of environmental land management scheme on that piece of land. So effectively that piece of land is being paid for twice by the taxpayer.
That's not really the case, since the new entrant wouldn't be eligible for the legacy BPS payment, so there won't be new people coming on to the legacy scheme. So from the point of view of the Treasury and people taking interest in these things, the actual cost, if you like, that's the relevant one is what the BPS payment would have been in the final remaining years that it was being wound down.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Jake, we've got so many questions from the audience, but thanks for that question. Sally.
So this time it's from Rob Hitch with a follow-up. And Mr. Eustice, you'll be unsurprised that this is rearing its head. 10 days ago, you said sheep farmers should convert to beef production given the cut in basic payments. Won't English beef production migrate to Scotland and Wales, which retain more support? And I've had 7 other questions asking along the same lines of how is there going to be a level playing field for farmers in England, given that in Scotland and in Wales and elsewhere, there is still going to be direct support. What are you going to do within that internal market to make sure that English farmers are not disadvantaged? And I have to declare my interest, given that I am a Scottish farmer.
Well, look, different parts of the UK will have the freedom, more freedom than they do now, to pursue their own policies. Of course, it's already the case that even under the Common Agricultural Policy, each part of the UK has pursued its own approach when it comes to the Pillar 2 agri-environment schemes, designing their own schemes, and each has a slightly different one. In future, they will, yes, have far more freedom to pursue their own policies. I think in general, though, it's only the case that Scottish farmers would have an advantage if you believe that the Common Agricultural Policy is as good as it gets and is the best possible type of agricultural policy available anytime in the world, at any time in history, or any time in future. If, like me, you happen to think that the Common Agricultural Policy is actually a bit of a basket case, well, then you should work to improve it. And I think what will happen over time is that as England demonstrates a better way to support our farmers, other devolved administrations will see those opportunities too, will see the chance to do things differently, will want to learn from our experiences, and will probably follow us. But we will have a coordinating group between the whole family of UK nations to coordinate policy, share best practice, share ideas, share thoughts on what's working and what's not working, so that we can all learn from one another as we move through this progressive change.
Thank you, Secretary of State. We are almost up for time. So, Sally, may we just have maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'll go back to our panel for some final thoughts.
Of course. Please, could the Secretary of State confirm if he sees greater production of fruit and veg, or is the vision for greater imports? If import substitution is the vision, how will this be achieved? And that's been asked by Ali Kapper.
Thank you. Yes, I do. It depends largely in many of these areas on whether we have a free trade agreement with the European Union. But as I have said before, and you referenced earlier, in the event that there is no free trade agreement and that tariffs are applied in both directions, yes, that would cause some challenges for sectors like sheep, where we're a net exporter. But for all those areas where we are currently a net importer, there will be opportunities, new opportunities for our domestic producers, who will follow market signals and produce more for that domestic market. If there are tariffs on Irish beef, there'll be opportunities for beef producers. If there are tariffs on dairy products from Denmark, there'll be opportunities for our dairy farmers. And yes, if there are tariffs as well on fruit and vegetables coming from the European Union, that will create new opportunities. In many of these areas, and the fruit and veg sector is probably one of our most innovative sectors. It's traditionally not been subsidized. It's only really in this latest CAP scheme that the area payment came into play at all. We're highly self-sufficient in all of the sectors where we traditionally had no subsidy at all. So on strawberries, we are now very self-sufficient in this country with a season spanning 9 months. The same is true on many veg crops, such as potatoes, and on everything from beetroot and carrots and so forth, and peas as well. In those areas that have not traditionally been subsidized, we have vibrant, innovative sectors that are producing almost all that we need. And there will be new opportunities in more sectors if we leave the European Union and if the EU choose to apply tariffs in both directions.
Thank you, Secretary of State. And I think we've probably got time for 1 more question, Sally.
One final, and sorry, Caroline, the forestry questions have been very thin on the ground today, but I'm sure you can elaborate on the forestry when you come to your own comments again. So Ben Atkinson is saying that he has set out on a transitional path to regenerative arable farming by reducing tillage and controlling traffic. Will my early adoption mean I miss out on proposed incentive grants? And there is also Angela Sargent following up with, will farmers who have already invested quite heavily in environmental schemes be able to access environmental monies, as they might not have the new land areas available?
No, they will benefit. Those who've been early adopters of the schemes that we want, if they're in a countryside stewardship scheme, we will be giving all of those people the ability to convert their scheme into environmental land management when it's ready to launch. Indeed, between now and 2024, we want to encourage more farmers to participate in countryside stewardship, because we can see that as being an important stepping stone to the new environmental land management scheme once that's launched. Those that are already heavily engaged in countryside stewardship will actually find that as we change the payment rates on countryside stewardship to go above and beyond income foregone and bring in different types of criteria, they will probably find it much easier to make up any loss in basic payment scheme. Those who've not participated at all have got a further journey to take, and we're going to support them on that journey and help them to take it. But there won't be any disadvantage to those businesses who were early adopters of the type of practices we want to see more commonplace in future.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary of State, and thank you, Sally, for fielding what I know were hundreds of questions. Your fingers probably sore from going up and down, scrolling on your phone. Look, we've got a few minutes left, and just in those last couple of minutes, I wonder if we could go back to our panel for their final thoughts. Thank you so much, Secretary of State, for being so honest and open to have questions filed at you from all corners. There's a few more thoughts here to leave you with. And Nick, I wonder if I could ask you to start our final thoughts.
Yeah, I would just urge you, Mr. Eustice, to look at countries like France, who have a completely different food system than ours. They eat hardly any processed food in comparison to us. They're probably lighter, healthier, and I think we maybe need to look over the water at what other people are doing and learn, and not possibly be a nation of unhealthy, obese people who can't get hold of local food.
Nick, thank you very much. Jake.
I think it's bold and ambitious, and I embrace that. I'm conscious, and it comes up again, detail, 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 but making sure that the new scheme is flexible and adaptable so that we can change our businesses to make them more sustainable. In the words of the Prime Minister, build a better environment, build a sustainable farming system, and build a future for our children's generations.
Jake, thank you very much. Sarah, your thoughts?
The question I was after an answer to was the impact of future policy, not the impact of what has gone before. And I think that is critical. We must avoid unintended consequences with whatever comes in this future policy. I'm absolutely up for regenerative agriculture. I'm absolutely up for a more diverse industry. But what I need at this moment in time is to be able to benchmark, to be able to forecast, to be able to know what's coming, and to be able to make sure my business is still here in 2025 when this government goes back to the polls again. And that's the moment at which we will judge the success or the failure of this policy. So please, please, please talk to farmers. We'll come with you, we'll support you, but we need some facts, and we need them pretty damn quick. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much. And Caroline.
Likewise, Sarah, foresters are with you too. If only we'd be more recognised, please. I'd like forestry operations and trees to be normalised into farming operations. Let's stop this binary play-off between forestry and agriculture. It doesn't help in an integrated land management going forward. And just let us help.
Many, many thanks indeed to you, Secretary of State, as I said, for having questions fired at you for the best part of an hour, to our panel for being fleet of mind and trenchant of opinion, and to you, our fantastic audience, for your amazing questions. Just leaves for me to thank you very much indeed.
The 1 minute silence will now begin.
Oh, sorry, we should be quiet now. And just to hand over to Sally for her very final thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. And to reiterate Sarah's thanks, thank you to you, our delegates, for joining us today. Thank you to the Secretary of State for giving up his time to share the future roadmap. To our panel, Sarah, Caroline, Nick and Jake. Sarah giving up her time to facilitate today, thank you. And to the whole OFC team who have been flat out this weekend, pulling it all together in such a short time frame. Our next Bite Size is back to our usual time this Thursday at 12 p.m, where we'll be re-exploring our theme from the 2000s, a climate of change, agriculture, the solution, not the problem. Hopefully George will join us. More information is available on our website, where you will also find more information on our 75th conference to be held in January, themed Business as Unusual, something I think each and every single one of us can relate to this year. We will again be joined by George Eustice and his counterparts from the devolved parliaments at our conference in January, amongst many other top-level speakers. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much for joining us, and bye-bye.